So we're still impacted today. Got more Rhetoric coming right up. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Common Sense, Logic, and Reason. And as always, I want to say thank y'all for joining me today. So, got more Rhetoric for y'all. We still impacted today is an example of fictitious notion. Again, a bunch of nonsense that black folks believe that's just simply not true. That blacks have been so brainwashed into believing, but they have no evidence to back it up. It just doesn't exist. Anyway, we know that black folks love to be victims. So many black folks have been brainwashed into being victims of a supposed alleged system that doesn't exist. Since it doesn't exist and they really can't cry about oppression today, one of the things that they love to do is to latch on the past. They love to run back to the past to try to be victims of the day, or use the past to fuel their race anger of the day, is what I say. Now they'll say, well, the excuse that they use to be able to cry about the past is they'll say, well, it's still happening though. I mean, we still feel the effects of the things that happened in the past. You know, segregation, Jim Crow, and all of these things. Black people today are still being impacted by all those things from the past. Now, obviously, I would say that's nonsense, that's insane. But there's a major flaw in that argument. Now, if you look at black folks from the past, the black folks who actually lived through all the oppression that they talk about, who actually saw segregation, Jim Crow, who perhaps saw the Ku Klux Klan, something that the overwhelming majority of black folks today have never seen no KKK. They've never even seen a Ku Klux Klan outfit, let alone any Ku Klux Klan marching down the streets of anybody, marching down any streets. But they'll say, you know, well, black people back then, if you look at statistically speaking, they were doing fine, very well fine in this country, despite of all that they lived through. You know, you look at the marriage rates amongst blacks back then. You know, their marriage rates was basically on par with white folks. And there was a point in time in which black folks had a better marriage rates than white people. And they also had better crime rates. You know, there was a point in time when the crime rates among black folks, those blacks back then, were lower than what white folks were. So they were better off. They had better crime stats. And by the way, when I say they, I'm speaking on black people in the past, because it's not us today. We didn't see that. Okay, they did that. They lived through those things, not us today. Ain't no they. Ain't no we. It's they. What they lived through. We ain't living through none of that today. I mean, black people were actually closing the income gap with white folks, right? And from 1940 to 1960, the poverty rates among black people would nearly cut in half. You know, in 1940 it was 87% poverty amongst black. By 1960, it was down to 47. So, like I said, they almost cut the poverty rates in half. Yet they did all of these things. So they built Black Wall Street, all of these towns that the black folks claim that they burned down everything. The white folks just burned down. They took everything. Well, in order for the white folks to quote unquote allegedly burn it down and take it, black folks had to build it. So black people were building things back then. As I said, the income gap between blacks and whites were closing, and black folks were doing very well amongst themselves. Well, matter of fact, there were probably the majority of blacks didn't even want to get involved in the civil rights movement, because they were like, well, we're good right here. Well, we're very good and happy living in our own towns amongst ourselves. So black people back then didn't seem to be impacted by it. Well, so if black people back then weren't impacted by all this stuff, then how exactly are black people today impacted? How are we today, or blacks today, more impacted by the stuff than black folks who actually lived through it? That's the question that have to be asked. Well, in reality, the reason why is because back then black people weren't perpetual victims. They did not have perpetual victimhood amongst blacks. They were basically facing real oppression, and they soldiered on in spite of that. Whereas black people today are more brainwashed than anything. So in reality, the impact with black folks supposedly claiming the effects that we feel today has absolutely nothing to do with anything in the past. That I've always said is actually what we feeling today of blacks is more the destruction of the black family, which had nothing to do with the past. It had to do, and I talked about this many times, of black females choosing to run behind third wave feminism, and they got the negative impact of that. You know, that sexual liberation movement. Well, they started becoming single mothers, messing with the pookies and the dudes that they wanted to, that society would shame them away from doing. Well, now the society couldn't shame them, or couldn't shame them as much, and they started becoming single mothers. And the Great Society basically allowed them to do all of that and be funded, and that right there led to the downfall of the black family. So the impacts that these blacks claims that we feel today has absolutely nothing at all to do with anything from the past. It has to do with what's going on today. Anyway, if you ever hear any of these race suffers start crying about we still feel the impacts of the things from the past, well, now you know, and knowing it's half the battle, and it's always y'all. Until next time.